Trees are very important in architectural sketching because often landscape accompanies architecture. So you'll be drawing a lot of them as far as entourage in your sketches. And I want you to have a lot of practice drawing them so that they're kind of second nature as you're creating these sketches to include the landscaping. By nature, a tree is basically a stick with some fluffy textured stuff around the stick. But a lot of times, if you're not familiar with drawing trees, they can look like broccoli stalks, and they can have a certain heaviness in the leaf area that just imbalances the sketch. So you want to keep your trees light and airy. I'm going to show you how to do that. So usually you want to start with the basic shape of the tree. Depending on the tree that you're looking at, it might be, more of a circle. Trees have all different shapes, so you need to identify a basic shape, and then there's always going to be a trunk in the center, right? So this is just a general, quick outline. But what you also want to do is add some interesting texture, because it's never going to look just like this. This looks like something, from a video game or a mushroom. So you want to add some of the texture, and sometimes groups of branches sort of stick out more than others. So you're going to want to add some of that, and it's okay to be kind of loose with it. Something like that. And then within the tree, this is already looking pretty good, but there's going to be kind of groups of branches that are a little more prominent that you can start to sort of highlight throughout, but you don't really need to do a ton of texture within the tree. And adding watercolor will also help to define those branches as well. And then for the trunk, usually it's mostly straight up and down. Some are thicker than others, so you want to pay attention to the overall scale. Then it might flare out a little bit at the bottom and maybe have a little bit of grass. Now, another thing that happens is you can see some of the branches or pieces of the trunk through the leaves. So often what I will do is add just a little indication of those branches kind of splaying out, especially where I know there's kind of an opening. So just a few to give that indication. Notice how the trunk continues up the middle and then the branches kind of come off to the side. So just lightly indicating, maybe some heavier lines here and there. But it kind of splays outward, but you've also got this trunk in the center that continues straight through the tree. And usually you want, as you get to the edge of the leaves, you want to lighten it because it's getting to be those really thin branches. So your heavier lines should be closer to the trunk, and then they dissipate the closer they get to the edge of the leaves. For adding watercolor, you want to think too about highlights and shadows of the tree. So what direction is the sun hitting this tree? I'm going to just assume that the sun is on this side, and of course the sun is pretty high in the sky, so the most highlight might be at the top right side of the tree, and then that means on the opposite side it's going to be darker, more heavily saturated green, or even some black shadows in there. So start thinking about those tint and shade exercises that you've done and how you can apply that to the color of the tree. But it's always darker, even if you're not sure exactly where the sun is hitting it. Usually you can bet it's going to be darker green at the bottom of the tree, because it's just further away from the sun, closer to the ground. And then you'll have a darker area under the trunk where the leaves are shading that area of the tree. So I am going to mix, starting with my sap green. Sap green is definitely going to be a better choice. You can see it's more of a grass green color than the Viridian hue. Your colors might be different, but look for that more natural green color as opposed to, you know, a putt-putt golf course. You could also mix in some burnt umber or other browns that you may have. That's a pretty natural color to use. And then the yellows too, yellow ochre or even this cadmium yellow. I would stay away from the lemon yellows, so it's usually not quite that bright. So you can incorporate some of the yellows as well. For this one, I'm going to use the wet on wet method. And you could try like a touch of the Viridian hue. It depends on the kind of tree that you're looking at. They're all going to have different variations. So I get my brush pretty saturated, and then I use sort of a tapping method. I'm not pressing hard because that can ruin your brush, which is another reason that you want a lot of water on your brush, because it helps preserve the brush. But I'm thinking about these patches of branches that I have, and I'm just sort of tapping in the watercolor as if they're groups of leaves. More color here. And I'm thinking too, I'm going to add more water to this area because that's going to be my highlight area. So I'm really not overthinking it. I'm just sort of having fun adding the color, and already it's starting to come to life. Now for me, and maybe for you, I like to have paper towel handy to just get up some of that color that maybe I put too much down, so that helps to give the illusion of the highlight there. And what also helps with the lightness of the tree, instead of it being really heavy, is to show the white of the paper through the branches. So that indicates a lightness. You got light, the sunlight coming through the trees. Just like if you look up at a tree, usually there's sunlight filtering down. So that's what that starts to imply. So this is already looking pretty nice. I'm going to darken the bottom even more though, so I'll get a lot of my green and a lot of my brown, and then just a touch of the black, maybe a little more green here. So I've got this darker hue that I'm working with, and I'm again just going to sort of tap that in. And this is the wet on wet, so see how it's starting to spread? So you don't want to overdo it. Just want to add as much as you think you should have on this side of the tree. And if you see some yellow, you know, you can go back and maybe that can enhance the sort of highlight the sunlight coming through. And I'm going to let this dry because if I start adding brown here for the trunk, it's going to bleed. So I would first let this dry and move on to another portion. Now this tree, yeah, it's already dry. So I started with sort of this base color, just a light green. So this is another method. This method is more about layering. So after this dries, you may find that you need more layers. Maybe you need more darker pieces on the middle to give more variation throughout the tree. So you could always come back with a different layer once it's dry. That's what watercolor is all about. So this one's already dry, so I could do the same method where I'm coming back with a darker green color, and I can sort of dab that in. So this texture, you know, I can make small blotches, small spots, or large ones depending on how I hold the brush. So you can control that. You can use a different size brush too. If you use the tip, that's going to be smaller leaves. But notice the difference here. I can control it more adding another layer after it's dry than when I'm using the wet on wet method. That just makes everything spread. So if you're wanting to add more detail or more variation with the texture, wait for that bottom layer to dry and then come back and add some of those texture pieces. And that gives a nice variation too between all the layers. And you can continue to add more layers. I could let this dry and then add, even darker layers. You can get some brown. But it creates definitely a different look using the layering method than this. Now this might be enough though. If your tree is far away, you may not need to add a lot of texture like this. This may be enough for your sketch because the trees are usually secondary to the architecture. They're the supporting players. So practice this type of variation and practice, your trunk too. I just grabbed a little bit of the burnt umber, and then you can add a bit of shadow to the top. And then see what you can come up with, and I think you'll find this an enjoyable exercise.